So, should we welcome everybody to this special learning session with Ariel Goldberg? We're talking about re-envisioning the Israeli-Diaspora relationship. And I'm not going to give a longer introduction because everybody here knows Ari very well. He's one of our family, right?
Right.
So,
okay, good morning, Shavua Tov. I hope everyone enjoyed having the extra hour of sleep last night. I know I certainly did. And welcome back to our home in Washington, D.C. I can't believe that it's been almost 6 months since I last had the privilege of learning with Adas Shalom, and the pandemic is still going on. But our tradition teaches us that with every machla there is a refuah, that whenever we experience an affliction, it also comes with opportunities for healing. And I know for me, for a lot of people I know, the opportunity to connect with other Jewish learners around the world and with our friends and family in other cities over Zoom has been a real lifesaver during the pandemic. So I'm thankful that we have other opportunities to learn this way, and hopefully next time in person. And when we learned together in July, our topic was the revitalization of Judaism in Israel, one of the most incredible stories going on in the Jewish world today. We're going to be talking this morning about revitalizing the Israel-Diaspora relationship. That is not a story that has the same feel-good energy, because there are a lot of tensions going on in the Israel-Diaspora relationship right now. But at the same time, there's a lot to be thankful for and a lot that we can tap into. I'm going to move to the PowerPoint now. Okay. So what does it mean to be a Zionist in the diaspora in the 21st century? Back in the 1980s, the United Jewish Appeal had a famous poster that you see on the right, which says, "We're all in the same boat." And in good rabbinic fashion, I'm going to ask, are we in the same boat? Have we ever been in the same boat? Should we be in the same boat? And in good rabbinic fashion, I believe the answer is yes and no, as we'll see. We are one people. We're part of a Brit Goral, of a covenant of destiny, a covenant that we entered into according to tradition when we left Mitzrayim, a covenant that comes before the covenant at Sinai, where we received the Torah. And in 2020, that means that whether we're secular or religious, Reform, Orthodox, conservative, diaspora, Israeli, Jews, we're one people. At the same time, Israeli Jews and Jews in the North American part of the diaspora are living in very different societies with different values, different priorities, different kinds of social arrangements. And that gives us very divergent perspectives at times on what it means to be Jewish and even what the purpose of Israel should be. On the bottom left, I have a quote from an Israeli educator, the former head of education at Hebrew University, Professor Gidon Shmoni, who says that the challenge for diaspora Zionism is how to maintain what he calls the familial peoplehood feeling. You can tell he's not a native English speaker. The familial peoplehood feeling that allows continued attachment to the Jews of Israel, despite our sometimes feeling alienated from the policies of the state of Israel. And how we might do that is something that we're going to look at today. How we can feel connected to Israel as a society, even if we feel misaligned with what the government is doing. In 2017, I had the privilege of hearing Natan Sharansky speak. He was one of my childhood heroes when he was the most famous prisoner of Zion in the former Soviet Union. He's someone that I greatly admire as an adult for the way that he's led the Jewish people in Israel and the diaspora as the head of the Jewish Agency and as one of the most articulate observers of the Israeli-Diaspora relationship. And if you want to go deeper into this topic, I highly recommend his new book, Never Alone, which came out just a month ago, and is part memoir, part exploration of the Israel-Diaspora relationship. When I heard Sharansky speak in 2017, he said something that really left an imprint on me. He talked about how he does not lose sleep over the future of the state of Israel, but he does lose sleep over the future of the Israel-Diaspora relationship. I could really relate to what Natan was saying. Having lived in Israel and experienced the ingenuity and the resourcefulness and the bitachon, the faithfulness of Israelis toward their country, I am hopeful that with continued hard work, Israel will be chai v'kayam, alive and vibrant for a long, long, long time. But the Israel-Diaspora relationship is another story. And the real irony of it is, as Sharansky pointed out, that the relationship has gotten a lot more tense because of the successes of both communities. I compare, as a therapist, I work as a therapist on weekdays, I compare this to the empty nest syndrome, where a couple may put their differences aside in order to deal with fundamental challenges that their family faces, raising children, overcoming illnesses, finding economic security. And then once those missions are accomplished and that stability is attained, their differences have the opportunity to come out again. And then they face a turning point. They can either decide that their differences are irreconcilable, or they can move from a relationship that's based on mutual need and even codependence into a relationship that's based on positive values, on what they like in each other, on the good that they see in the relationship, even as they may acknowledge there are problems and things they don't like about the other person. That's where Israel and the diaspora are at right now. Baruch Hashem, there are no Jews today in 2020 who are living under repressive regimes. It's an unbelievable fact when you think of the last 4,000 years of Jewish history. With very small exceptions, like a couple hundred Jews left in Yemen and a few other places, any Jew that wants to make Aliyah can make Aliyah. Israel is thriving. Israel has more companies traded on the NASDAQ now than the entire EU. Its economy has had a higher rate of growth in recent years than the United States or Canada in some years. It's thriving culturally. It's a nucleus of Jewish creativity. And when we look at the Jewish communities in Canada and the United States, although they certainly have their challenges, the communities are secure. Neither Canadian or American Jews have to worry about being kicked out of their countries and needing to flee to Israel. And this is why neither community has to be dependent on the other anymore. As I'm sure many of you remember, when Israel was founded, it could not survive without the economic support of the diaspora. The country was economically bankrupt after the War of Independence. Israel bonds, UJA federation campaigns, North American philanthropists helped keep the country afloat. North American Jews, as I'm sure many of you also remember, valued Israel as a guarantee that they would have a safe place to go. In the 1950s and 60s and 70s, a majority of the North American Jewish community either were former refugees or the children or the grandchildren of them, and Canada and the United States were not integrated multicultural societies that they are today, where Jews could be sure that they would be safe. And now, despite certain resurgences of anti-Semitism, there's a much greater sense of confidence and safety. So now the challenge becomes for Israel and the diaspora, how can we have a relationship that's based not on the need to help each other survive, but on affirmation of our relationship and what we value in each other? Now, when Sharansky talked about losing sleep over the Israel-Diaspora relationship, he was, of course, thinking primarily of the United States and speaking to an American audience in New York. Had he been speaking about Canada, he might have qualified it a bit, because Canada has one of the strongest Israel-Diaspora relationships of any diaspora community in the world. And Israelis who are familiar with the diaspora certainly know about this. These are a joint issue of a stamp that came out in 2008 to mark the 60th anniversary of Israeli-Canadian relations. Canadian Jews, I find, are often very quick to celebrate our connection with Israel, and we should. It's a very special connection. But what about our differences? Can we be honest about that? True love involves recognizing differences, involves recognizing what you don't like in each other, and working on that, working on communication. Can we do that? And how much do we really know about each other? In my observation, there are a lot of misunderstandings that Israeli Jews and North American Jews, even Canadian Jews, have about each other that create a real strain in the communication. There are a few attitudes I want to highlight that I think will help us in what we're exploring today. On the left, and I mean this half joking, half seriously, keep calm, it's only politics. What I mean by that is that the story of Israel-Diaspora relations is bigger than any politician or current events that are coming up. There's a larger story underneath it that I think we often miss just from following the media, and that we need to hone in on. Two Jewish values, hakarat hatov, that's the idea of gratitude, that while we shouldn't be Pollyannas and ignore the problems in the Israel-Diaspora relationship, it's important to be proactive about seeing the good. Because let's face it, as humans, we have what psychology calls a negativity bias. It's twice as easy for us to see negativity in another as it is to see positivity. So we have to work at having that sense of acknowledging the good. And then there's non-judging, the have dan et kol ha'adam l'kaf zchut, which are very similar. The idea being that you should always give a person the benefit of the doubt. Again, that doesn't mean let them off easy, but be non-judging. Before you make a conclusion about someone or about Israeli society or Israelis about the diaspora, suspend your judgment, suspend your baggage, listen, learn, recognize the limits of what you understand, learn together, dialogue, and people tend to go a lot farther than if they start wagging their fingers at each other, criticizing and judging. Any data that you see about Canadian Jews today is coming out of the 2018 Survey of Jews in Canada, unless otherwise noted. Most of the data that you see about Israeli Jews is coming from the book #Israeli-Judaism, which I discussed in depth in my last presentation. I highly recommend it. It's based on the most comprehensive study of Jewish identity in Israel ever undertaken. It was done by the Jewish People's Policy Institute, an important think tank in Israel that is led by scholars from Israel and the diaspora. And Erwin Kotler is on their board, on their executive right now. When you hear me talk about how Israelis view issues, I'm going to talk about the Israeli center, and I just want to say a word about that. As you can see from the graph on your left, the center, 55% of Israeli Jews identify with the political center, 37% with the right, and only 8% with the left. So I certainly acknowledge that there will be views to the left of what I'm talking about and views to the right. However, given our limited time, I'm going to focus on what the majority in the center thinks to the best of my understanding. You can also see that reflected on the right-hand side with the breakdown of the last Knesset. Both the Likud party and Kahol v'Levan are considered centrist parties. Just briefly, we see a different picture in Canada where you have 48% of Canadian Jews voting for parties that are left of center or left wing, and only 32% voting for the Conservative Party. This is a difference that cannot be ignored. As we'll see again and again, we are coming at this relationship from very different perspectives, from very different societies, even as we're one people. Okay, before we start to discuss different viewpoints on the relationship, I think it's important that everyone here have an opportunity to share some of their own viewpoints. And to facilitate this, I'm going to use a nice typology that Thomas Friedman, who writes for the New York Times, came up with. There are 3 things he feels diaspora Jews ought to understand about Israel. And he says this having lived in Israel for a decade, speaking Hebrew, and having observed Israel very closely. Number 1, Israel does amazing things. Amazing things internally, amazing things with the diaspora, amazing things internationally. Israel does some bad things in all of those domains. Israel messes up, as all democracies do. I mean, I need look no further than the country I'm living in right now than the United States, which I have a great deal of admiration for, but it's capable of colossal screw-ups at times. Israel is located in a very tough neighborhood, and its citizens face enormous challenges every day, as great as any faced by citizens of other democracies. So I'd like us to take a minute and to welcome each of you using the chat function on the side of your screen to respond to each of these prompts. What is an amazing thing that you've experienced in Israel? And I emphasize you. In other words, we don't want abstract responses like it's amazing that Israel is a refuge for persecuted Jews, unless you were a persecuted Jew who made Aliyah to Israel. But you could say, when I go to Israel, I feel spiritually energized. Same thing with bad things, something you've experienced personally in Israel. And number 3, what is a challenge that Israelis live with that you know a bit about, but would like to learn more about? So let's take a minute. Please write it in the chat function on the side of the screen. Okay, Mr. Goldberg, do we have any responses?
Oh, we have lots.
Okay.
You can always expect a Dashalom to be opinionated.
In the interest of time, and I apologize for this because I didn't know how many responses there would be, can you please read the first 6? And in terms of the others, I promise you I will read every one and learn from it later on. But I don't think we have time for everything right now. Okay, so go ahead.
They're very short, so I think we may have time for more, Ari.
Okay.
Okay, I'm not going to say who made these comments. I'm just going to read.
No.
Yeah. The first one is energized and met my wife at Hebrew U in Jerusalem. The achievement, urban scale desalination. Now, I can imagine who wrote that. I know who wrote that, and everybody else can figure it out too.
Okay.
Hospitality, strong friendships, strong family relationships, negative overcrowding. Positive, seeing my grandchildren growing up as Israelis. Positive, I feel at home there. Positive, the most amazing thing I experienced in Israel was camping in the Negev. It is so vast and there is no one around you, yet I know Israel is a small country. Negative, bad, support for settlements on what should be Palestinian land.
Whoever answered that did not put it in the first person, just editorial comment. And I just want to explain that. I did not earlier. The reason why I think it's so important that we put this in the first person is that from a psychological perspective, there is such a vast difference between reading about something and understanding it, which is important, and experiencing something. And one of the disconnects in the Israel-Diaspora relationship, as I understand it, is that each side may have a fair amount of knowledge about each other, but have they experienced what the other goes through? Have they felt it in their kishkas, lived it out? Big difference. So that's why the purpose of this exercise was for people to talk about something they've experienced firsthand. Okay.
Negative, seeing hatred for Arabs in Israel. Another one, the worst thing I experienced in Israel is its bureaucratic rules. Trying to get a birth certificate for my daughter and now trying to amend that certificate. Negative, I don't like that women cannot pray in an egalitarian situation at the Kotel. Positive, wondering if they could ever have cohesive politics. My parents fled from the Holocaust and living through the birth of the state, Six-Day War, and being evacuated through the Burma Road in 1948. Wondering if they could challenge Israeli-Palestinian relationship, future of democracy, achieving good governance.
Okay, well, these were great responses, and you're all in very good company because there are many people in the diaspora today who feel about Israel as you do. One of the biggest tensions in the relationship right now is between liberal-minded Canadians and Americans, politically liberal and or Jewishly liberal, as in conservative reform reconstructionist. And there are a lot of liberal Jews who ask, how can I feel aligned with a state that doesn't recognize my form of Judaism? There are a lot of politically liberal Jews who ask, how can I feel aligned with a nation state where the consensus is right of center and nationalistic, and Israel engages in military activity that I'm just not sympathetic to? Also, there are some who feel I'm a believer in multiculturalism. How can I feel aligned with a country that deports asylum seekers? And how do Israelis feel when they look at the diaspora and think about how the diaspora views them. Here is an interesting window onto that. With a nice Ottawa connection, Corey Gill Schuster, who grew up in Ottawa, he's Shana Schuster's son, started a foundation that makes videos called Ask an Israeli, Ask a Palestinian, and you see on the screen how they do it. People send questions in from around the world. They send their camera crew out to interview people on the street, average Israelis, average Palestinians. They include the interviews uncensored, unedited. And so he did one with random Israelis about the how they view the Israel-Diaspora relationship. And I took two of the most articulate responses and made a little video to show you. So let's have a look.
נגיד שיש הרבה יהודים שהם נגד מה שקורה בשטחים,
או
נגד ביבי. אכפת לך?
אכפת לי מאוד. אני חושבת שמאוד קשה ליהודים שגרים בחו"ל להבין מה שקורה באמת במדינת ישראל. מה שמראים שם בחדשות ובתקשורת זה שונה לגמרי מהמציאות. ובתור אחת שמטיילת הרבה בחו"ל, אני יכולה להבין למה הם חושבים בצורה כזאת. אבל אם היה באמת אכפת להם ממדינת ישראל, מהקיום שלה, בין אם מדובר במדינה דמוקרטית ובין אם מדובר במדינה יהודית, הם היו צריכים לבוא לכאן ולחיות כאן תקופה מסוימת כדי להבין בדיוק מה קורה כאן. אני מעריכה שהיהודים שלא נמצאים באותו קו פוליטי מרכז ימינה, הם פשוט מנותקים מהמציאות לחלוטין. ואם הם היו מגיעים לפה לתקופה של שבועיים, שלושה או חודש לפחות, והיו מרגישים על בשרם מה זה להיות ישראלי, אני בטוחה שהשקפת עולם שלהם הייתה משתנה לחלוטין. פשוט נוח להם לגור בשמה, ואתה יודע, תמיד שמה, זה נראה אחרת מאשר שאתה כאן, זה לא יעזור.
יש דוגמה שנתקלת בו? שמישהו אמר לך משהו, סליחה, זה לא ככה.
פחות מדברים איתי על פוליטיקה כשאני בחו"ל, ואם כן, אז אני מאוד משתדלת לייצר תדמית של באמת, של מדינה שהיא מאוד דמוקרטית, שנותנת באמת, אפשר להביע פה דעה ולא משנה מאיזה מגזר אתה, ושהפוליטיקה בישראל בעצם מורכבת מרוב של אנשים שהם מבינים את המציאות על כל המורכבות שלה בעצם. אנחנו עושים את המקסימום כדי שתהיה לנו מדינה נהדרת, לגור בה כולם ביחד.
מי זה כולם? ערבים ויהודים מתכוונת?
ערבים ויהודים ודתיים וחילונים, והבעיה שכל קבוצה פה, אתה יודע, מנסה למשוך יותר לכיוון אחר. במקום שיהיה קצת יותר מאוחד ומלוכד.
Maybe I got the time wrong, I don't know.
מדינת ישראל היא מדינה נהדרת, הכי יפה, הכי טובה והכי איכותית שאפשר לגור בה אי פעם. אפשר ללכת לבקר במקומות אחרים. מדינת ישראל לגור.
האם חשוב לך?
Okay, I won't play the second one since we don't have the sound, unfortunately. But what this gentleman talks about is the fact that more than he cares about whether the diaspora agrees with the policies of Israel, and he goes on to say that he himself is left of center, not in agreement with the current government. He wants Jews in the diaspora to understand how the challenges Israelis are living with and the joys and achievements that they value so much in the country. And this, I think, is ikar, an intrinsic point. We don't have to agree. A stable, strong relationship doesn't mean that both parties have to agree with each other. But it is essential that people work at understanding each other. And this has been my own experience. I came to Israel as with fairly left of center views on Israel, on the religious situation, on the situation in the disputed territories. And I left several years later with roughly the same position, although maybe I had moved politically somewhat closer to the center. So what was the difference? The difference was I had grown significantly in my ability to understand Israelis. I no longer stood in judgment over people on the right, over people in the major settlement blocks, over many Palestinian groups, over ultra-Orthodox groups. I understood their stories. It doesn't mean that I agree with them. It doesn't mean I wouldn't demonstrate against them in certain situations. But it means that I'm prepared to sit down and have a dialogue with them, with a more open heart and a more open mind, with sensitivity, where I want to hear their story and learn from them. And I want them to learn from me and hear my story as a diaspora Jew, rather than have us trade judgments with each other and say, you're betraying Judaism. No, you're betraying Judaism, as sometimes can happen in the Israel-Diaspora relationship. The first video that you saw referenced the quality of life in Israel. I want to show briefly two indications that I think are very telling. Israel has the highest birth rate of any developed country in the world. That is not due to the ultra-Orthodox population. It's due primarily to secular Israelis having larger families. As sociologists will tell us, there is no stronger indicator of a country's faith in itself and of its quality of life than the desire to have more children, to bring new people into this country. That is a beautiful thing. Israel's Jewish population has increased tenfold since independence. If Canada had undergone a population growth like that, there would now be around 200 million people in Canada. So what is Zionism, and what can Zionism be in a nutshell? For its first century, Zionism was very much about Tzionut Medinit, political Zionism or status Zionism, best represented by Theodor Herzl. The goal is to settle and build the land, to create a physical Jewish state, and to redeem the Jewish people by changing their social conditions. And Zionism has accomplished that in a very short period of time. The state exists, it's able to defend itself. That's a fact. At the same time as political Zionism arose, there were other approaches to Zionism that came to life, most notably spiritual Zionism, Tzionut Ruchanit, which was first associated with the Russian Jewish writer Asher Ginsburg, better known by his pen name Echad Ha'am, which means a man of the people. Echad Ha'am was prophetic in his understanding of what Zionism could become. He understood at a time when Herzl and company believed that eventually all the Jews in the world should make Aliyah, that the diaspora had no future. He understood that not all Jews would want to come to the Jewish state. But Zionism isn't just about building a physical state for the Jewish people. It's about creating a national home. And it's not just about saving Jewish human beings. It's about renewing Judaism by creating a spiritual center for Judaism. And it's a two-way street. It's about bringing Jews to the homeland, but also about bringing the homeland to the Jews, about the cultural and spiritual light of Israel radiating out to the diaspora, and Jews in Israel being able to learn from the diaspora. And he's famous for his quote, "More than the Jews have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jews." Namely, that in addition to the belief that some Jews hold, that I personally hold, that it's a mitzvah to observe Shabbat, it serves a very powerful cultural purpose of keeping us as a people. Shabbat is part of our genius, this opportunity to recharge and be a community, to reconnect with creation. And we can't let go of that. And you see Hebrew letters on the upper right corner. The revival of Hebrew was one of the greatest achievements of spiritual Zionism. Today, as we said, the task of physical Zionism has been 90% completed. There is still work to be done to defend Israel, but Israel is a strong country. Its economy is strong, it's culturally strong. The work of Zionism in the 21st century, both in Israel and the diaspora, is the work of spiritual Zionism. As I spoke about in my last presentation, it's the work of not just creating a state for the Jews, but revitalizing Judaism in Israel. And the same goes in the diaspora. We exist in security. We exist in relative prosperity. The task for Jews in Canada in the 21st century is to revitalize Judaism, make it relevant, make sure it can survive for the next century. Shlilit HaGalut, in the first part of Zionism, really up until the 1990s, the diaspora was looked down upon. It was expected to disappear. And so here you see two pieces of Zionist iconography that show that. You see the Jew as this cast down refugee in both of them. You see on the right the angel, Gabriel pointing him towards Israel, where proud Jews standing upright are cultivating the field. And you see poor looking Jewish refugees on the left-hand side walking through the desert towards Israel. A lot of people talked about the importance of Israel as a cultural center. A lot of people in Adash Shalom, a lot of people in the Jewish world in general. It's really interesting to see that among Israelis, plurality see Jewish culture and tradition as the main point of connection with Jews in the diaspora. Not political activism, not fighting for each other's survival, but the culture that we share, that we want to continue to vitalize and grow. You can also see here from the Canadian Jewish Demographic Study and the JPPI study that an identical number of Israeli and Canadian Jews, 64%, reported that being Jewish is very important to them. So that's a real point of connection. When we look at how Canadian Jews are connected to Israel, at first it looks to be pretty good. You see here that 48% responded that they feel very attached, 31% somewhat attached. A very large majority of Canadian Jews, we'll see the graph later, but I think it's 80%, have visited Israel. Many Canadian Jews can read Hebrew. So it looks pretty good. And when we compare it to American Jews on the right-hand side, we do have a lot to be proud of as Canadians. But here's a more worrying presentation of where Canadian Zionism is at. If you look at this generational graph, the caring about Israel is the blue stripe. And you can see that for Jews under the age of 44, it dips below the 40% mark. Whereas for Jews, for your generation, the baby boomers, it's at around 50, and for people 75 and older, it's at around 57. So why is this? Robert Brim, who conducted the study and who was also my sociology professor once upon a time, commented that it has to do with us getting further and further away as a people from the defining events of 20th century Jewish history. Your generation, the baby boomers, and those of you older, grew up in the aftermath of the Holocaust, can remember the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War. I, on the other hand, am a millennial who's 41 years old. I can vaguely remember the struggle for Soviet Jewry. I remember the day that Sharansky was freed. But for most of my life, Israel has been a strong, vital country. And it's understandable that many of my contemporaries take it for granted, don't understand that it's something that we have to constantly work on developing. That even if it's physically stable, there's so much to work on in our relationship and in the revitalization of Judaism there and in creating a just society. Very briefly, when it comes to Zionism in Canada, it played a major role from the beginning because Canadian Jews were very spread out. You see that in no region of the country now in 2020 do Canadian Jews make up more than 1% to 2% of the population. Canada is so vast. So Zionism was the first movement in Canadian Jewish history that united Jews. Just as Zionism was the first global Jewish movement that could unite Jews from Yemen, from Montreal, and from Moscow in a common effort. And the same machloket, debate between cultural Zionism and political Zionism that existed in the Zionist movement at large existed in Canada. Clarence de Sola, who was sort of the leader of Canadian Jewry and Canadian Zionism in the early 20th century, talked about Zionism as securing a home for oppressed Jews while declaring our loyalty to the country we live in. In other words, we'll write checks, we'll support you, we're not making Aliyah anytime soon. A.M. Klein, the great Canadian Jewish writer, wrote an essay about becoming spiritual chalutzim in Canada, that Zionism can energize us to be better Jews in Canada and work on energizing Canadian Jewish culture. Israel right now has 44% of the Jews in the world. And in 1948, it had 8% of Jews in the world. The JPPI estimates that by 2043, only 22 years from now, Israel will have close to 60% of the Jews in the world. And North America will continue to decline in its numbers. This is an important reason why we cannot let our relationship, the diaspora's relationship to Israel, go. There are people who have talked about maybe we need a divorce, maybe we've just gotten too different. This is a clear indication that would be foolish. Another thing that Israel does for us is as a spiritual nucleus. Whatever the tensions that are going on in the relationship, you send a plane load of Jews from Canada or the United States to Israel on birthright, and an average of 90% of them report that it's been a transformative experience, that they felt more Jewish than they ever did before, that they're energized. Israel is a spiritual nucleus that can energize us through being there, but also through absorbing its culture, through absorbing the Torah that comes out of the country, through learning from the life examples of people there and how they're living Jewishly and facing existential challenges. This is a platform called 929, where you learn a perek, a chapter of Tanakh every day. And it's an amazing Israeli-Diaspora co-project. You will see many commentaries by people from the ultra-Orthodox through to people who are doing queer interpretations of Torah. It is just such a rush when I look at it every day. Israel is a Jewish society. Judaism is meant to be lived out in society. The Torah and the Talmud are a blueprint for creating a just society where people will be treated with the dignity they deserve, having been created in the image of God. Israel is far from completing that mission. It's the work of millennia. But Israel, as a majority Jewish society, is where that can go on. North America has given many gifts to Israel. The icon on the left represents the Israeli feminist movement, which was started by women who had either made Aliyah from the United States and Canada and England, or studied in those countries and got exposed. Jewish intentional communities, very much like the Chavurah movement, are blossoming all over Israel. There are internship programs with Jewish renewal and conservative shuls in North America where Israelis from these communities go to learn about liberal Judaism and how they can bring that to Israelis who are interested in a non-Orthodox form of Judaism. On the bottom, you see the first two women to be ordained as Orthodox rabbis in Israel, Rabbi Rachel Berkowitz, Rabbi Mishhammer Kasoy, who taught my wife, and the idea of women's ordination in all of the movements was another export from the diaspora to Israel, as are the whole concept of having a good Israeli think tanks that can wrestle with how to make Judaism relevant in the 21st century, how to negotiate the idea, the existence of Judaism in the form of a state, something we haven't had for 2,000 years. But for all that good, we have enormous tensions. Rabbi Dr. Daniel Gordis just wrote an excellent book called We Stand Divided about the tensions in the Israeli-American relationship. But many of these issues apply to Canada also, and it's well worth reading. In a nutshell, North American Jews live in liberal democracies. Israelis live in a nation state, two very different social arrangements. They were created for different purposes. They have different values. They have different visions of Judaism. For North American Jews, there is a very strong focus on tikkun olam, on repairing the world. If you look at the survey of Canadian Jews, 72% say the most important thing for them about being Jewish is living a moral and ethical life, followed by remembering the Holocaust and then celebrating Jewish holidays with families. When Canadian and American Jews who are non-Orthodox think of the Tanakh, three catchphrases are the ones you see on the bottom right, which someone had printed on COVID masks. Olam Chesed Yevaneh from Tehillim, we will build a world of kindness. V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, love your fellow person as yourself. And of course, tzedek tzedek tirdof, justice, justice pursue. Things are a bit different in Israel. Israelis rate Holocaust remembrance near the top of their list, but belief in God is very high up there, whereas for Canadian Jews, it was in the high 50s. It wasn't even included on that graph that I just showed you, which tells you something. 72% serving in the IDF. North American Jews can't relate to that. Now, here's something interesting. 57% say living an ethical and moral life. Does that mean that Israelis are unethical and immoral? Ma pitom. Absolutely not. But what it means is where the different communities are putting the priority. Doesn't mean that Israelis are dishonest in their personal lives or that they don't give to tzedakah. But in terms of what they see as being a good Jew and where to put their energy, a lot more energy goes into serving in the IDF, building the country, developing the country, than it does to campaigns for tikkun olam. If Israelis open their Tanakh, three phrases that will jump out at them are, Ki et kol haaretz asher ata ro'eh lecha etneh ulezorecha ad olam. For all the land that you see before you, I will give to you and unto your descendants forever. Lecha eten et haaretz hazot. Unto you am I giving the land. And then uvarech kol minei tvuah letova v'ten bracha al pnei ha'adamah, which is from the Amidah, and I will bless all manner of produce for good and give a blessing onto the land. We can't ignore the fact that Canada is a liberal democracy. and Israel is a nation state, a democratic nation state. How do we define a democratic nation state? It's a state where, according to UNESCO, where cultural boundaries match up with political boundaries, where there's a large majority of people who are part of the same culture and speak the same language, and the fundament in a democratic nation state, there is a dialectic between the needs of the majority to promote and preserve and vitalize their culture and the protection of individual rights. Israel's basic law makes clear in the first article that Israel is both a nation state and a democracy, where Judaism is promoted, but individual civil liberties are maintained. And just what that means is a big debate, but the point is that the country values both. Canada and the United States are liberal democracies. The basic unit of organization is the rights-bearing individual. Canada has a very weak concept of group rights, which the Quebecois don't like very much. You may get language rights as an individual in Canada, but the idea of groups having rights is not a very strong current in Canadian constitutionalism. And you see that the Israeli Declaration of Independence opens with, the land of Israel was the birthplace of Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. So from the get-go, it's about national identity. And it also talks in the postscript about the importance of the diaspora. How does the Charter of Rights and Freedoms start? With a list of individual rights. It's not talking about the nation. It's talking about the dignities that you have as an individual to pursue your own good, to make your own choices. Israel has individual rights, but it's also about obligations. You're obligated to serve your country in the army. You may be obligated to lay down your life for your country in that service. And there are many other obligations that Israelis bear, such as high taxes, such as the tensions that they have to live with due to the security situation that come with being in a nation state. So we're living in fundamentally different societies. Jews in the diaspora are a minority who look outward, who want to integrate into society. Israeli Jews look inward to building up their own society where they're the majority. In a nation state, there's a strong focus on identity. In a liberal democracy, there's a focus on freedom. Israel focuses a lot on achriyut, on responsibility for itself and the Jewish people. Jews in the diaspora are very focused on tikkun olam. And there's essentially pluralism in the diaspora, but in Israel you have orthodoxy as an established form of Judaism. The tension that we're talking about between the universal and the particular has been going on throughout Jewish history and throughout human history. It's nothing new. Professor Gil Troy talks about the difference between a Davidian, as in King David outlook, and an Isaiah, as in Isaiah the prophet outlook. Isaiah is about universal peace, beating the swords into plowshares. David is the strong military chieftain who conquers and settles the land. Israelis tend to be Davidian. It doesn't mean that they don't value peace, that they don't value the good of other nations, Israel, but it's where the priority, where the emphasis is. And there's also a debate in human history about whether the higher value is to seek the good of your own nation, to create your own just, self-sufficient, self-supporting society, or whether the priority should be on humanity at large. And that debate will probably go on forever. Before we begin to wrap up, Israel sometimes gets flack from liberal-minded Jews for being a nation state. They cannot really reconcile the fact that it's a country that isn't a secular liberal democracy, with a separation of religion and state. I want to draw your attention here. This is the demographic makeup of Spain. You notice that Spain is also a democratic nation state, as is Iceland, as is Finland, Sweden, Norway, Japan, South Korea. Being a nation state does not mean you cannot be a democracy. And here we have Professor Ruth Gavison, Zichronah Livracha. She died just a month ago. One of Israel's most important legal minds. And when she served as a judge, she wrote some of the most important decisions protecting secular freedom, the freedom of non-Orthodox Jews in Israel. But at the same time, she also wrote a decision supporting the right of the state to ban the sale of chametz on Pesach, even though there are some Jews who don't keep kosher on Pesach. And she wrote, the real tension is not between Israel's Jewish and democratic aspects, but between competing ideas within democracy, which are forced to find a balance between complete civic equality and freedom and, on the other hand, freedom for the majority to chart the country's course. So what does Ruth mean here? Well, if Israel was a liberal democracy with a total separation of religion and state, the warmth that so many of you talked about, the strong Jewish feelings that you felt in coming to Israel would not be nearly as strong if a purpose of the country was not to promote and celebrate and vitalize Judaism, as only a nation state can. But it would also not be a Jewish state if it ran roughshod over the rights of minorities, which is why the Israeli Basic Law guarantees individual rights. But in situations where the two clash, a debate will open up among jurists, and in situations like the chametz law on Pesach, they may find that it's a legitimate constraint to put on the minority, in this case the minority who don't keep kosher, to not sell chametz during Pesach, because that is important for preserving Jewish culture. And that's an important part of a nation state. If the Norwegians didn't have Norway, they would be unable to preserve their language, to support their culture. They would assimilate into other cultures, and the world would lose their unique genius. Ruth also has a typology of Israeli civil discourse, and we're going to wrap up with this. There are three important discourses that go on within Israeli society, which she sums up as, who is a Jew? Who is an Israeli? What are the boundaries of Israel? And we don't have too much time to go into a fourth issue that diaspora Jews face, which is the delegitimation of Israel, especially on college campuses. But I'd just like to draw your attention to Sharansky's 3Ds. The 3D test of anti-Semitism is where he differentiates between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. Demonization, double standards, using a double standard to compare Israel to other countries that say use military force, delegitimatization, like that boycott Israel sign on the bottom. It's one thing to criticize Israel, it's another to say that it doesn't exist, or to lump it in as that t-shirt on the left does, with racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. And I can tell you, having studied at an American college campus, this is a very serious problem, both in the United States and Canada. And we risk losing a large part of the next generation of potential Zionists in our countries, because on so many campuses, including York, including Carleton, including Concordia, to out yourself as a Zionist is risking social ostracism for kids who have liberal friends, for kids who want to join progressive organizations. They're sometimes forced to pledge that they're not a Zionist. It's a really serious problem. So briefly, the issue of who is a Jew has been coming up since the creation of the State of Israel, which is why I showed an old poster for a lecture on this from 1950. On the one hand, Israel has been an enormous success on the issue of who is a Jew. Because if you look at the bottom left, these are all Israelis. Israelis come in every color of the spectrum. And Israel has been an amazing example of a multiracial society, far more so than North America, where most Jews are Ashkenazi and white. And Sephardim are now, and Mizrahim are now a majority. You can find them in all positions of power, although there hasn't yet been a Sephardi prime minister. But other than that, they're everywhere. That's been a huge success. A real problem has been with the recognition of non-Orthodox Jewish movements in Israel, namely Reform and Conservative. So why has that happened? Well, part of it, as we saw last time, has to do with the fact that there are very small movements in Israel, only 7% of the population, according to the JPPI study and the conservative movement's own statistics. Nevertheless, if Israel is to be a homeland for the Jewish people, as it was always intended to be, then all Jews have to feel comfortable. Jews who want to hold an egalitarian prayer service at the Kotel need to be able to do so. And this graph on the bottom, which you may not be able to see so well, shows that there's almost a majority of traditional and Orthodox Jews who support egalitarian prayer at the Kotel, and a large majority of secular Jews. So why isn't it happening? Well, on one foot, it's not happening because, number one, these movements are very small in Israel, and number two, the primary issues that Israelis vote on are security and the economy. For most Israelis, unless you're a convert, which is only about 5% of the population, they don't have much of an issue with the chief rabbinate having control over marriage, divorce, conversion, and burial. It's like a public utility, like the phone company. It does its thing. And if you're Sephardi, your ancestors didn't come from Europe. Reform and Conservative are new North American movements that you're not familiar with. But what's interesting is that 65% of Israelis support the Diaspora Jewry in advancing religious freedom. They do see that there's a problem, and they do believe there should be activism. They're just not prioritizing it right now because the security and economic issues are so great. We all have a stake in this issue, and we all have important things to say, and we can teach Israelis through dialogue about what it's like to live in a more religiously pluralistic Jewish community. The battle for pluralism is unfolding on the streets. You can't go to an egalitarian prayer service at the Kotel yet. In the bottom left-hand corner, you see the women of the wall about to be rushed by a group of ultra-Orthodox female protesters. But if you step out from the Kotel and go about 100 feet, you come to Robinson's Arch, which is the new egalitarian prayer section, not part of the original Kotel, but part of the same wall, part that was uncovered after 1967. That's a picture of a bat mitzvah that I went to there. On the bottom left is a poster, part of a series of Orthodox Jews who are going to the Gay Pride March and talking about how important it is for them to support their friends and loved ones. If you walk out further into Jerusalem, or into most downtown cores of Israeli cities on a Friday night, you will find your pick of minyanim, open Orthodox minyanim, the movement that I'm part of, ultra-Orthodox minyanim, Reform, Conservative, Jewish renewal style minyanim. If you ask most Israelis, actually, they will tell you that the country is very religiously pluralistic because you have all these different kinds of shuls and because there are no religious police that stop someone who wants to spend Shabbat going for a drive and eating shrimp. They don't understand the difficulties that liberal Jews can face if they want to make Aliyah or if they've converted abroad. Who is an Israeli is another place that we can have input. living as a majority, Israelis don't understand necessarily, particularly younger Israelis, Sabras, what it's like to be a minority. So this is something that we can contribute. For many Israelis, because they are a nationalistic country, their perspective is, our goal has to be preserving a Jewish majority. There is a huge tide of refugees in the world, and it's only going to get larger. And Israel is at the crossroads of many of these countries that have refugee crises. We can't keep letting refugees in. We just can't, or it'll harm the Jewish character of the state. To which liberal-minded Jews in Israel and the diaspora will respond, "V'ahavtem et hager ki geram hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim." Love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And this is one of many situations that reminds you of the old Jewish joke, where two people come to a bet din with a dispute, and the rabbi tells one of them, "You're right." And the rabbi tells the second one, "You're also right." And then they both say in unison, "How can we both be right?" And the rabbi smiles and says, "You're right." There are arguments to be made from both sides. What's the truth? We have to be in dialogue with each other and wrestle with this together without judging each other to come to the best understanding. The picture on the bottom left-hand corner is of a Filipino-Israeli woman, Rosa Fotanas, who won the Israeli equivalent of American Idol. She has an amazing voice, and the question a lot of people are asking is she an Israeli? She's not a citizen. She came as a refugee, but is she an Israeli? On the top left, I wanted to draw attention to the fact that even as Israel has at times expelled asylum seekers, there are also a lot of very positive things that Israel is doing internationally that don't get the recognition they deserve. This is a picture of a field hospital that Israel set up on the Golan Heights, where to date, 10,000 Syrians, some of whom were even supporters of ISIS, who were wounded in the fighting in the Syrian civil war, have received free cutting-edge medical care. Some of them have even been evacuated into Israel for further hospitalization and then returned to the Syrian border. It's a remarkable story. And Israel will sometimes be the first country in the world when there's a disaster in the developing world to send mobile hospitals. But we as North American Jews can have a lot to contribute with our perspective, and it can help Israel become more of an Or LaGoyim, of a light unto the nations, that is one of its stated purposes in its Declaration of Independence. Now, you've probably been wondering, when's he going to get to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Well, I saved that for almost last. The last area of discourse is, what are the boundaries of Israel? And the irony about this is, it's a topic, it's one of the most talked about things in the Israel-Diaspora relationship, at least in the diaspora. But study after study after study has shown that it is one of the areas of the Israeli-Diaspora relationship where diaspora Jews have the least impact. My teacher, Yossi Klein Halevi, whose quote you see on the side, told me when we were chatting recently that he knows of not one issue of security policy in Israel where lobbying from diaspora Jews has made the slightest difference. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't, he's just pointing it out. That we have we're far more listened to around issues to do with Jewish identity, Jewish peoplehood, even refugees, than we are around what the security policy of Israel should be. And I think in some ways that is understandable, because far too often there's a hectoring tone to the way diaspora Jews discuss the security situation. It is not fair for us. We're not bearing the burden. We're not sending our sons and daughters into the army and standing at the gravesides of loved ones who've been killed in terror attacks or killed in army service to stand over Israel in judgment. That does not mean, I want to be clear, that it's a shanda for the goyim for us to speak out. We should speak out. Sometimes being outside of the bubble can give us a perspective that's valuable to Israelis, but we need to do it with a lot of humility because, as we said earlier, there's a vast difference between reading about something, however knowledgeable you are, however important that is, and living it and feeling it in your kishkas and bearing the burden that Israelis bear. So we have to speak in dialogue with humility, not saying the Israeli dispute with the Palestinians is a violation of Judaism. That is not a good way to get Israel's attention. It's a good way to turn them off and make them quite angry. It's really no different in a personal relationship than a well-meaning friend or loved one telling you when you're having a personal problem, oh, I know exactly how you feel and I know what you need to do. No, you don't. You haven't lived my life. Maybe in dialogue with you, I can learn things from your experience that I'll want to integrate, but your story is not my story. And for you to claim that it is, it's not very helpful. This is just showing the fact that Israelis, a majority of Israelis would like a two-state solution, but at the same time, the Israeli center, a plurality of Israelis believe that the settlements are helping Israeli security. And that, in a nutshell, is what the Israeli center is about. It's about wanting to make territorial concessions, but also putting a strong premium on security. In other words, not peace now, not peace at any cost. And Yossi Klein Halevi wrote, "We need a partnership in anguish who struggle together with us over the security consequences of creating a Palestinian state and the moral and demographic consequences of not creating one." So both the left and the right got things correct. The left understands that Israel will pay enormous costs if there isn't eventually a Palestinian state created. But when they tried to do so in 2000, it led to a horrible bloodletting of over 1,100 Israelis. The right was correct in that the Palestinian administration in its current undemocratic and repressive form is not a partner that you can make peace with. So the best that we can do for Israelis, Yossi believes, is to be dialogue partners and to process and reflect with them about the consequences of both the left's argument and the right's argument, and to try to find a more centrist, pragmatic understanding, which many Israelis are starting to come to. Okay, what can we all do at home? One of the most important things is learning Hebrew. This is an old Zionist propaganda poster that says, Ha'ivrit gesher lechaim b'Yisrael. Hebrew is the bridge to life in Israel. The soul of a people is bound up with its language. We are the only major diasporic community in 2,000 years of diaspora that does not speak a Jewish language. We lose out on such an important part of Jewish identity and of Israel if we do not comprehend Hebrew. Fortunately, it has never been easier with all of the different apps like Duolingo and Rosetta Stone. If you're prepared to put in half an hour a day, you can get a fair level of comprehension of Hebrew within a year. And that opens a whole world in that if you're reading, if you're only following Israel through reading articles in translation, you're missing out on a large part of the story. The Jerusalem Post, which I know a lot of you read, is written by English speakers for English speakers. It's a fine newspaper, but it does not represent the views of mainstream Israelis. It never intended to. Haaretz is a far left paper, also has some excellent articles, but it's not giving you the centrist perspective. For that, I recommend turning to Ynet, which is Yediot Achronot is the largest circulating paper in Israel. And what you'll see are articles that were originally written in Hebrew, that are translated, that are written by Israelis for Israelis. Gives you a very different perspective. Of the English language journalists, I feel that my teacher and friend Yossi Klein Halevi really gets it, that his journalism captures a wide variety of perspectives and the moral dilemmas. So I strongly recommend following anything he has to say. And also the Times of Israel platform, which has bloggers from across the Israeli spectrum, is another excellent source. We went from Shlilit Hagalut, the negation of the diaspora, to the catchphrase in Israel-Diaspora relations in 2020, Chizuk HaTfutzot, strengthening the diaspora. In 2018, for the first time, more money flowed out of Israel for Zionist programming in the diaspora than came from the diaspora itself. It's remarkable. For all the strains in the relationship, for all the misunderstandings that exist, there's a fundamental commitment, unlike any other diaspora in the world. The most successful Israel-Diaspora initiative is Birthright, which so far has brought 500,000 Jews to Israel. And whatever else may be going on, whatever tension between the liberal movements and the chief rabbinate, 90% of Jews who go on Birthright report that it's been a transformative experience for them, as do so many adults who visit on their own. There's a nitzutz, a pintele yid, a spark of Jewishness in us all that gets ignited in Israel. And when we're not in the country, there are ways that we can participate in the substantive dialogue, which is so important. I think one of the most important gifts that Judaism has given the world is the power of dialogue, of machlokot l'shem shamayim, of arguments for the sake of heaven. But it's so important that we argue not to win, as Sharansky says, but to understand each other. That it be more about listening and less about judging one another. And two places that I think set the standard for doing that in North America are the Shalom Hartman Institute and the Tikva Fund, both of which are Israeli organizations with strong satellites here. If you watch their webinars, participate in their discussion groups, go to their conferences, which also happen occasionally in Toronto, bring their speakers to Ottawa, you will hear very thoughtful Israeli voices who are interested in dialogue and in exploring the future of the Israeli-Diaspora relationship. And there's a lot of richness in their programming. So in conclusion, if I had to leave us with one message, it would be keep calm and Am Yisrael Chai. And coming back to where we started, Danit Kol Ha'adam L'Kaf Zchut. Anyone in an extended family knows that we don't necessarily agree with our loved ones, and that having each other's back does not require that we speak in the same voice or always agree. It does mean that we work on trying to empathize with each other, even if we don't agree. And the fact is, as Professor Gil Troy has pointed out, you only argue with people you care about things that you care about. There's been a lot of vitriol and even mudslinging in the Israel-Diaspora relationship, with whether it's Canadian Jews or American Jews and their Israeli counterparts over the last 20 years. But we wouldn't be arguing if we didn't care about each other deep down, if we didn't care about the Jewish people. If we didn't care, we would just walk away. So that is something to have gratitude for, that we do care. We just have to find a more constructive way of arguing that focuses on understanding. And if Jewish history has taught us anything, it's that no part of the Jewish people can make it alone. In 1880, only 1% of the Jews in the world lived in Israel and North America combined. And today it's over 90%. And the Jews of the Arab lands and of Europe, who made up close to 80% of the Jews in the world in 1880, those communities hardly exist anymore. So we never know what the future might bring in terms of our need for survival. And we can only imagine what the future can bring in terms of what we can accomplish together for the revival of Judaism in the 21st century and sharing its light with each other and the world. Thank you very much for your attention. I know that this has gone a bit over time. For anyone who would care to stick around, we have time now for some questions and dialogue amongst ourselves. So if you'd like to speak, feel free to unmute yourself, and then please remute yourself after you've asked your question.
Toda Rabbi Rav Ari, Hashiur Hayam Ma'anyen Mitsuyan.
Bekef.
And now it's time for people to ask questions, and I'll let you handle the questions by just letting people raise their hand and you can pick on them, okay?
Yeah, great.
Excellent and very interesting.
Thank you.
Presentation. Thank you.
It's funny, I can't see everyone in one gallery, so I would ask you, please, if you have a question, just fire away. Turn on your mic and speak up. Please, Cheryl.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just wondering, you know, when you talk about the center has moved right over the past 10 years or so, or even longer. So what used to be liberal is in Canada is almost a form of what was conservative 20 years ago. And I'm wondering how, if that is a factor when we look at young Jews being less affiliated and attached to Israel, that their politics may be what was considered center left before, but now is considered left?
Yes, that's a very important issue. It was a lot easier for North American Jews to be Zionists in some ways when Israel identified itself as a social democratic state, as a leftist country, and Jews themselves identified as liberals or leftists. Now, progressivism has moved to the left in North America, and the Israeli political consensus has not moved to the far right, but it's definitely right of center. And that creates a real disconnect and creates tension. Liberal Jews in North America are understandably grateful to be living in a liberal state. And some sociologists have argued that Jews have benefited more from liberal freedoms than any other minority in either the United States or Canada. Our ancestors came to North America as refugees, as a hated, persecuted people, and now we occupy the top rungs of power and privilege in the society. How amazing is that? How much is there to be grateful for? And so many North American liberal-minded Jews project their liberal values onto Israel, which is a very different kind of society. And I'm not saying one is better and one is worse. I mean, I have my own opinions, but for the sake of dialogue, I don't think it matters. It's just that they are different societies and they're viewing each other through those lenses. And there are a lot of Israelis who have knee-jerk reactions as nationalists, thinking, how can North American Jews be so assimilated? Why don't they remember where they come from, that they're part of the Jewish nation? or even going so far as to believe there's a small majority of Israeli Jews who believe the North American Jewish community is a legitimate community. It's not that North American Jews have to move to Israel, but it won't last because of assimilation. It will die out in a generation or two. They don't understand how much creativity is going on in the United States and Canada to revitalize Judaism and how much they could learn from it. More and more are, but too many don't know about the incredible things that go on here. So we each have knee-jerk reactions from our perspective, especially with college students who identify as progressive. They can feel an enormous tension between their progressive values and the values of the mainstream in Israel, which is center-right. And it's very hard for many people I know in that situation. But the more that they can meet Israelis and dialogue with them, meet them at people to people and form connections, the more that they can have a relationship that's bigger than politics. To go back to the question we started with, that involves a love for the Jewish people that transcends your political affiliation, whether it's left or right.
Ari?
Yeah.
I think I'm just following up on what Cheryl said, but we've got a larger percentage of intermarriage now in North America. How do the Israelis view that?
With a lot of judgment and criticism, and not enough understanding that, you know, there are interfaith families that are trying to raise Jewish children. Yeah, that's something that they need to understand better also. Okay, over to Natalie and Ilan. Please, my dear friends, please unmute yourselves.
Hi, thank you so much, Yashav Koach, for this wonderful presentation. I really learned a lot. Thank you. I know that I see that you've put a lot of time, effort, and wisdom into it.
Thank you.
I'm curious about, I don't have much data or like background on just the experience, the impact of Israelis who like leave the homeland and go to like diaspora communities. Like you would think that they would, because of the nationalism of Israel, they would spread Zionism. But oftentimes in my own personal experience, I don't see that happening. It's, so I'm curious, I guess my question is, in terms of like data or your own observations or knowledge, do you see the out-migration of Israelis as like, how do you see that out-migration of Israelis?
Sure. First of all, it's a really good question that I'd like to learn more about, but I'll share a few things that I have in mind at the moment. There is about a 10% rate of Yerida, of out-migration from Israel, which is equivalent to the number of Canadians who move abroad, myself included. Thinking actually in Canada, it's a bit higher. In Canada, it's currently about 12%. And Israelis tend to leave Israel for the same reason that Canadians tend to leave Canada for work. Not to say that the Israeli economy is booming, but they may get a good job opportunity in San Francisco and leave for a couple of years or leave permanently. Prior to around the year 2000, if you were an Israeli who left Israel, the mark of Cain was upon you, both among many other Israelis and sometimes among diaspora Jewish communities. It is shocking that in Canada, in Toronto and Montreal, Israelis who left Israel until the mid-1970s could not apply for funds from any Jewish welfare organizations. They were treated as traitors who had left the Promised Land. Now things have changed a great deal. Because the focus in Israel is on Tfutzot, diaspora, not on Golah, exile. You know, an exile is something negative, something you're forced to do at gunpoint, usually. a diaspora is something voluntary. We're living in a globalized world where people move around a lot. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to move. Israel's a highly educated country, so it's not so surprising that a lot of Israelis migrate for temporarily or permanently to other countries. And over the last 20 years, the Jewish Agency has been doing a lot more to engage Israelis who are living in the diaspora to do exactly what you were talking about, Natalie, to share their experience, to integrate into Jewish communities. And that endeavor is really just starting. And I think it'll be interesting to see what happens, because I think they have a lot to contribute. You know, just as North Americans who come to Israel have a lot to share about their Jewish experience in the diaspora, what it's like to be a minority, what it's like to experience Jewish pluralism, etc.
Do you think that there's more that both Israel and Jewish communities in Canada working together should do to try to reconnect young adults with Israel? Obviously there's birthright, but you know, especially on university campuses, should there be more of a presence, more programs, more understanding generated?
Absolutely. This is one of the possibilities that really opens up, you know, living in the digital age. Another program that the Jewish Agency has is called Mifgash, which means meeting, which is where they have programs for Jews who are in Israel on birthright or on other programs to meet with their Israeli peers and form person-to-person relationships. And interestingly enough, with the pandemic starting, they've moved their programs online, and that opens some amazing possibilities to continue to do this afterwards, to have you know, have one college campus, Hillel, paired up with a group of students, you know, at the Technion or at Tel Aviv University, who they, you know, meet with to schmooze once a month, talk about their lives, to talk about their Jewish experiences. There's so much of a feeling of peoplehood that can be gained from that, and opportunities to learn from each other and even challenge each other. So the Jewish Agency takes what you're talking about, Estelle, very seriously. And their whole raison d'etre now is not primarily to bring Jews on Aliyah, but to fulfill spiritual Zionism, to bring the homeland to the Jews wherever they are, and to reinforce the sense of peoplehood by building bridges between Jews in the diaspora and Jews in Israel.
Say something? Hello?
Lionel?
Lionel here. Yeah, we were talking before about like kind of the left-right spectrum and shift to the right. But I mean, my opinion is that the issues are too complicated to lay them out on a kind of one-dimensional continuum. Like say, like in Israel, what would you classify the Haredim as being? I mean, usually we think of them as being on the right. I mean, would you agree? But I mean, like in terms of say redistribution, I mean, they're quite happy to accept lots of government handouts. And I mean, in general, I mean, in Israel, you have like, there's the left and right in terms of like economic policies, but there's also left and right in terms of like attitudes to, you know, territorial concessions. I mean, like, what would you say is the essence that distinguishes left from right in Israel?
So the left-right spectrum is primarily about security, and to a secondary extent about economics. So the interesting thing is, when it comes to the Haredim, to the ultra-Orthodox, their political parties tend to sell themselves to the highest bidder. So they've been happy to form, back when there were Labour Party governments. They were happy to form governments with them. They've been happy to form governments with Likud and with Kadima. And they are themselves surprisingly pragmatic on issues to do with territorial compromise. You know, the former head of Shas, Rabbi Avadia, and founder of Shas, Rabbi Avadia Yosef, the great spiritual leader of Sephardi Jewry, was a dove on territorial compromise and supported Yitzhak Rabin's government with his own party. So they're not on the far right, although they are religiously. And while we're on the topic of the Haredim, just as an interesting tangent, one of the most, I think, perspective and hopeful insights I've heard about solving the religion and state issue in Israel and the rights of liberal Jews came from a Haredi, from an ultra-Orthodox commentator, who's also by the name of Dov Lipman, who served in the Knesset with the Yesh Atid party and is a big believer in bridge building. And his perspective is, there is a quiet revolution going on in the Haredi world. Increasingly larger numbers of ultra-Orthodox Jews are getting educated, are entering the workforce. Some of them are even voluntarily joining the army. And those numbers will only grow. And as that happens, as they get to meet non-ultra-Orthodox Israelis, it will serve as a moderating force. And it will mean that the ultra-Orthodox parties will get less and less support from the ultra-Orthodox community. Just as Shas, the Sephardi religious party, used to be much more powerful than it is now, but as Sfaradim and Mizrahim have become more and more integrated into Israeli society, they've started voting for whatever party their conscience tells them to vote for. They've started voting for mainstream parties. That will happen to the Haredim within a generation also. Their power will be diminished. Their power to make and break coalition governments will be diminished. And then pragmatic compromises on the Kotel and on reform and conservative conversion will become a lot more possible, God willing.
But I mean, certainly demographically, their power won't be diminished. I mean, like I know, I remember reading that Ben Gurion, when he granted them exemption for military service, I mean, he thought that, you know, the Haredim would eventually just disappear.
Yes, but the question is, one thing we talked about the last time we learned together is the dirty secret of the Haredi community, which is how high their own rate of attrition is. We're talking about 20%, which is higher than their fertility rate. It doesn't mean that these people become secular, but about 20% of ultra-Orthodox Jews become modern Orthodox, religious Zionist Jews, or some of them become secular. So there is an out-migration from the Haredi community that is higher than their birth rate. And they're becoming more and more a part of Israeli society. So we'll have to talk again in 25 years and follow up on how that's doing. I think
I often wonder, like, if someone who's a Haredi Jew wants to immigrate to Israel, I mean, do they make any effort to determine whether he holds strongly anti-Zionist views? And I mean, it's...
Not really, no. Okay, I think we have time for one final question. Would anyone else like to ask anything?
Cheryl?
Okay, Cheryl, you have another question?
Because I've already asked a question. Anybody else?
Yeah, does anyone else have something they'd like to ask?
Okay.
Go for it.
My question is, I think in the 70s to 2010, we saw a reduction in anti-Semitism, and I think that was a response to Holocaust education and understanding and maybe even collective guilt. As that memory fades, you could see an increase in anti-Semitism. And I'm wondering if you could look into a crystal ball, how is that going to affect the diaspora, Israeli relationship in 5 years or 10 years?
That is a very good question. I'd like to think about that for a moment before I respond. First of all, I think that, I mean, that's a really great topic for another webinar. Why has there been a resurgence of anti-Semitism? The first thing that I want to say is that just as the tension between Israel and the diaspora is a lot less about what either side does, and mainly about what each side is, a nation state and a liberal democracy, pluralistic Judaism versus Orthodox dominated Judaism. Anti-Semitism is primarily not about what the Jews are doing or what Israel does, but the fact that Israel exists and the fact that the Jewish people exist, and that Israel flies in the face of the universalizing tendencies of the left. Like John Lennon's song, Imagine, we should have no religions, we should have no borders, we should have no countries. Now, they don't apply that criticism to non-democracies or to most nation states. They don't apply it to Japan, they don't apply it to Singapore or to Finland. It is applied to Israel. That is where the double standard comes in. And this is becoming increasingly a part of the Jewish experience, especially on campuses. Israelis are used to it. Israelis are used to, you know, feeling negativity from groups around the world. And I think that if we can have a substantive dialogue, there's support that we can give one another. One of the things that I most admire about Israelis is that they have such deep pride as Jews. They don't apologize for themselves. They don't apologize for being proud Jews and having a Jewish state. They live their lives and they live pretty good lives. As a minority, there's still a certain amount of anxiety that North American Jews have, even in my generation. Will we be accepted? Can we be ourselves and still be progressives and still be liberal, etc.? And I think that Israelis can straighten our backs to some extent and teach us about what it means to have pride. I think we can teach Israelis about not taking that sense of pride too far into a sense of arrogance, into a sense of not caring what the rest of the world thinks. We shouldn't be beholden to world opinion, but Israelis should be willing to learn when there is productive criticism coming from non-Jews in other countries, coming from Jews. That's something that we can teach Israelis that frankly they could do better with. Because there can be an attitude in the country of, you know, to heck with the rest of the world. They've never liked us and they never will. I'm not saying the majority of Israelis feel that way, but it's a current that you find in Israeli society. And that can also lead to alienation from diaspora Jewry, a sense that we're the real Jews. A good Jew is someone who lives in Israel and goes to the army, as 70% of respondents to the JPPI study about Israeli Judaism affirmed. So there needs to be, Israelis and diaspora Jews have a thing or two to learn about humility. We have to learn what it's like to be bearing the burdens that Israelis bear and experiencing the many gifts and achievements that Israel has to offer, and stop, you know, wagging our fingers as sometimes goes on and accusing Israel with its military policy of betraying the values of Judaism. as we saw, looking at the different approaches to the Jewish outlook on the world. There's universalism and there's particularism. There's the Davidian approach that prioritizes nation building and national defense. There's the Isaiah approach that prioritizes universal brotherhood and sisterhood and working for the good of the world. Both of them are very real parts of Judaism. We prioritize our Judaism differently, but they're both very real. And we need to acknowledge that, as Israelis say, yesh ma lismoach b'shnei hatzadot. There's what to lean on both sides. And halavai, that we could each learn from each other and bring both of those perspectives to the table and broaden our perspectives from hearing each other's experience. I have seen that happen, in my own life and in the lives of others. And in some ways, it's Jewish peoplehood at its best. We've been arguing with each other for 4 millennia, and when we do it well, we learn from each other and we grow together, and the Jewish people are the better for it.
Amen. I think that's a great way to end the session today. What do you think?
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you all for your attention and your participation. And 2 weeks from now, there will be another learning opportunity, which I promise will not go as long. We're going to be listening to Israeli music that interprets the Tanakh to see how Israelis relate from their unique world to the Torah. And it's going to include music from the Hasidic Song Festival, things that are more contemporary, and it should be a lot of fun. So that'll be 2 weeks from today, November 15th. And hopefully the US presidential election will be settled by then.
Amen.
From your mouth to God's ear on that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody. This was fantastic.
Stay healthy.
I really appreciate it.
So much.
Okay, bye for now.